So I recently featured a book in my bug out bag video called 1 Second After. And a lot of you noticed it sitting in my tent, and a lot of people said, hey, that's an excellent book and it should almost be a required read for anybody in the preparedness community. And I agree with that. It's a very good work of fiction that gives you a lot to think about in regards to a long-term SHTF scenario. And the author, William Fortune, obviously was well researched when it came to the effects of an EMP as well as what would happen in the aftermath to society. So definitely worth reading. And we're going to talk about 10 important lessons you can actually learn from this book based on what to expect on a long-term SHTF scenario type of situation. And if you're looking for this book, I will have links down in the pinned comment as well as in the description because I do think it's worth reading. You should definitely read this book if you're worried about your preparedness.
Spoiler alert.
Now, here's the first important lesson. Lesson number 1 is going to be that you won't admit it's SHTF right away. Nobody will actually be able to be comfortable with the idea that everything has gone south all of a sudden. So those first couple of days during a long-term SHTF scenario, no one is going to want to admit it, or no one's going to think of it as being a long-term situation. Everyone will assume it's temporary. The power's out, nothing's really moving, things aren't happening, but nobody's explaining it either. So therefore, we'll just wait a couple days, and I'm sure emergency services will come back online and we'll get everything taken care of. So what that does is it slows you down, and it can hurt your ability to take the opportunity of that time that it presents you with. Now, in the book, this is exactly what happens. Everybody in the town, all the main characters, nobody really expects that day to be the last day of their normal lives, right? Everyone thinks that, oh, the power's out, no big deal, give it a couple days, we'll be fine. And that mentality ends up being dangerous for the characters, and you'll see why here while we continually discuss all these other important lessons. So lesson number 2 is that you're gonna wait too long to act, and that's just what happens as well. So first off, you're in denial of the emergency actually occurring, but secondly, you're gonna wait too long to act on it. So a lot of us will be kind of sitting in our homes waiting for the emergency broadcast system to tell us what to do, and we won't be told anything. And then in that time, we could have been getting more supplies or getting things battened down or whatever you want to call it, in the sense of being prepared for whatever storm was about to approach. And instead, we're all just going to be waiting around to hear what happens next. And that could be very dangerous for you as well, especially if you have important needs. If you need certain things in order to survive, let's specifically talk about medication, then acting is very important in those first 24 to 48 hours, because it won't take very long before everyone catches on to the fact that this is going to last longer than we originally thought. And that's why the third important lesson from this book is to hit the pharmacy first. It doesn't even matter if you're on daily meds or if you need medicine to survive. The pharmacy is going to have a lot of things that we just need in general, and you gotta have medication, and you got to have first aid, and you got to have those types of supplies, or else down the road you're going to regret not having it. And especially if you're on medication, especially if you're on things that literally keep you alive, maybe you're diabetic, which is a big topic in the book. Maybe you need blood thinners or something like that because you have heart issues, or maybe you just need to go to the pharmacy to get some mental meds because you need some help with things like anxiety. Who knows what it is, but without that medication, life is going to become very, very difficult. And the problem is that if you don't go to the pharmacy first, somebody else will, and that entire stock will be cleared out so fast you won't have the option to extend your survival. So keep that in mind. If you're going to make one stop, or you're going to go out during some kind of a large-scale event that nobody's quite sure of what's happening yet, I would say the first stop might need to be the pharmacy, because without some of that medication, a lot of you might not make it. And without some of the things that a pharmacy has to offer, things will be much more difficult over time, and you won't have access to those things for very long at all, because the people who do need medication to survive and who do rely on it daily will definitely be going there after the first day or two, and then those stocks are just going to be completely diminished. So just keep all that in mind, okay? Now the fourth important lesson from the book that kind of goes hand in hand with that part of the conversation is that anything might run out. It's not going to just be medication. It could be literally anything you never thought of before just running out. And of course, once looting and everything else starts, people will just take whatever seems to have some kind of value because they're really not sure what it is they're going to need. But things like batteries are going to run out. Dog food's going to run out. Of course, we all saw what happened with toilet paper a couple years ago, right? All those things can just run out. Even if it's something you've never thought of having an issue with finding, might not be there. And if you have any concerns about not having enough of something, just already assume that during a long-term scenario, it will be gone. You will not have access to it, no matter how obscure it might be. And the book really talks about that quite a bit, especially in regards to something like cigarettes, right? Cigarettes disappear very fast. So does alcohol. People go back to their vices because of comfort and things that they need, and then immediately those things are gone, but they also suddenly become extremely valuable. Now, we'll talk about that right now because it just kind of makes sense. We're kind of segueing into everything. So the fifth important lesson that you have to really keep in mind when it comes to what this book is teaching you is that value can change by time. And what I'm referring to in regards to that is things like cigarettes, right? They started off during the book as being very hard to get, and then if you had them, they were extremely valuable, and you could use them for trade, or you could just use them as a gesture that had a lot of weight behind it. And as we know, during times like World War II and stuff like that, cigarettes were considered very valuable. So having cigarettes became a big deal. But over time, as cigarettes became more and more scarce and more people had to just face the fact that they weren't going to be able to smoke anymore, cigarettes lost their value. And then other things started to gain in value. And in this book, they specifically mention things like ammunition and small game and things like that. Meat especially became extremely valuable. So just keep in mind that even if something has value right in the beginning of an emergency, it might be valueless at some point in time just based on how much supply there is, based on how much demand there is, and based on what actually becomes more important to survival over time. You don't need cigarettes, you don't need alcohol. In the beginning, people are going to want them and they're going to think that they're well valued and coveted, but in the end, they're going to just want to be able to eat and drink clean water and survive. So all those values are going to change periodically throughout a long-term event, and anything we put a lot of value on right this second might not be worth anything a year from now based on whatever emergency it is we're dealing with. So another great lesson that the book taught me that could easily teach you as well. The sixth lesson, a very important lesson from this book that I think kind of really needs to be talked about more regularly. It's something that we have to remember as preppers because, listen, just because you have lots of food doesn't mean you won't be out of food, right? And just because you're well fed doesn't mean you will be well fed. And the reason I'm saying that is because in the book they demonstrate that no food for some really turns into no food for everyone, no matter who you are or what you're doing. And what they kind of allude to in the book is that yes, they go through and they start rationing the food supplies. Of course, they didn't get a handle on it as fast as they could have, so things get a lot thinner than they would have been otherwise. But the problem is that even the farmers out on the fringes of town and people who had cattle or people who had well-stocked food supplies and stuff, well, they were not only well known, but they were sought out because people were starving to death and they needed to be able to eat. And in order to justify rationing all the food for the entirety of the town had to then offer things like protection to these people's properties or to these people's cattle in order to give them a reason to hand over some of their resources. And the fact that they basically had to, in some ways, coerce these people to give over some of what it is they had should tell you that in any kind of large-scale event, you will be sought out no matter how far you live, no matter where you are in the sense of being remote. Some town somewhere close by is going to be looking for any resources available because they're managing thousands of people and they know what happens when thousands of people begin to starve. And you're just maybe one person. And you might be one person who's very well prepared or very well stocked. But at the end of the day, this town is going to be looking for the supplies that you have, and they're going to give you some options based on what it is they can provide you or what it is they may take from you, depending on how that conversation goes. And this is just what had to happen for that town to survive. And so all the cattle ranchers and stuff that were in their area had to give over their cattle, but in return, the town provided those ranchers with security and protection from some of these roaming gangs and everything else that was going on during the time. So there are things you have to consider when it comes to quid pro quo, and no matter how well prepared you are, if everyone is starving, you'll either be starving or you at the very least, better appear to be starving, okay? So just keep in mind, this book does eventually dive into the concept of cannibalism because people will turn to that. But we'll talk about that here in a second. And in regards to something that's very unhygienic, we'll talk about the seventh important lesson from this book, which is the fact that if there's no hygiene, then there's disease. And people get sick. And lots of people in this story get sick and die just because there's not basic hygiene. They don't have basic access to antibiotics, they don't have basic access to medicine, but they also don't have basic access to, hot water, running water in many cases. They're just not able to keep themselves clean, and by being unclean for a long period of time, they're getting very sick. And you mix that with things like malnutrition and the inability to eat well and starvation and everything else, and suddenly everybody starts to die off. So this is a consideration that needs to be made now. Understand that if you don't have supplies in regards to hygiene, how are you going to stay alive if everybody around you starts getting sick? You can't just assume that food is going to do it enough. You also have to have these other factors considered. Hygiene's just as important as food and water in many ways if we're talking a long-term scenario. If you're talking long-term, that means you're going to be able to eat and you're going to be able to drink throughout, or else you're going to die very early on. But if you're also worried about long-term and you have no hygiene or anything like that considered, then you're going to get sick at some point and probably just die anyway. So all of that is very important, and the town goes through many different epidemics, and they talk about things just as basic as, cholera, and they talk about the flu and just things that happen in modern society that we usually avoid by just washing our hands and things like that. But in this time, when there is no access to some of these general comforts that we're used to, people die from very basic sicknesses. So very important, and another lesson learned from this book. Now, the 8th lesson learned from this book, which goes back to kind of the cannibalism and things of that nature, is that people will be desperate to organize. There's desperation in organization when it comes to large groups of people. They need somebody to tell them what to do, or where to go, or how to behave, or whatever it is. It's not because people are desperate to be ruled. It's because without organization, there's chaos, there's anarchy, and things become extremely dangerous. So with some type of order, people feel they can be part of something and feel they have a place. And that's great, except for when that organization is created in a malicious way. When people get very desperate, they're going to look to anybody who can provide them with some sort of comfort or some sort of hope. And some of the false prophets in this book go around and start convincing people of horrible ideologies because they're able to. People are desperate and they're looking for answers. Somebody hasn't eaten in a week and comes across somebody who has some food, but that person says, look, the only way you're going to get this food is if you kneel down and start praying to the entity that I tell you have to pray to. There's a good chance that person is going to kneel down and start praying. And that's a lot of what you see. And a big showdown battle scenario that occurs within this story is because of a large group of people known as the posse, who are basically cannibals that are following in the ways of Satan, and they are being led by a singular person who basically said, look, I'm a prophet, I know what I'm talking about, we're all well fed now, we all feel good, we have to take what we want by force, there's no other way to do this, and without doing that we're all going to die anyway, so you got to follow me or else you're screwed. And you know what? He gets thousands of followers because there's desperate people that don't know what else to do, so they turn to terrible things like cannibalism. This will happen in a long-term situation, it just will. And not every false prophet has to be a terrible person. They might have good intentions, they might not turn to things like cannibalism, but people will still be looking for a leader and looking for somebody to point them in the right direction. And I think as preppers, you should have a good sense of the concept that you might need to be that person if you want things to go the way you feel they should. If you're willing to take a back seat to somebody else's ideology, well, then that person's gonna be running the boat and you're gonna be watching what happens from afar, and you're not going to have much of a say into how things start to shape. So keep that in mind. Leadership's very important. Having those skills to get people to rally behind you is important, building up morale, and having a say in how things are handled within your community could be a big difference in the sense of how you feel on the other side of things. Because you know what? No matter what the emergency or what the crisis, there will be eventually an end to it. And did you make it through in a righteous way? Or are you going to find yourself wishing you would have perished in the initial onslaught? These are all things to consider. Great lessons in this book. Now, the 9th lesson that's very important to learn from this book is that if you're an outsider, you better have some skills, or else you're not going to be allowed to stay. That's a huge part of the book, is that there's refugees moving through the area constantly. Like I say, very often, just because you're rural doesn't mean you're safe. These people will be around at some point. It's just how it's going to be. But they're well organized in the sense of not letting these people stick around if they don't want them to, but they are smart about picking out people with certain skills to allow them to stay, aka doctors, aka engineers, mechanics, people who could be useful in the sense of bringing the town back to life. But the problem is that you have a lot of these people that are outsiders that don't have these skills, and anytime something goes very wrong or anytime things get very difficult, people start pointing fingers because there's only a limited amount of resources. So do you want to be at the bottom of the list of somebody who would be able to, let's just say, be let go of because you have no skills and nothing to bring to the table. And it was all because you didn't introduce yourself to your community. You didn't interact with your community. No one knew who you were or what you were about. That is something a lot of people struggle with. Here in the preparedness community, we like OPSEC. We don't want to be giving away all of our secrets and everything else, right? But then the worst thing happens, we don't know anybody and nobody knows us. So come a situation where you do need that community to rely on and you need people to rely on, you're an outsider. And what happens then? Well, if you don't have anything to bring to the table, you're getting cut off. You're not going to get rations, you're not going to be allowed to stay or whatever it is. And you know what? We all love to assume that we can take care of ourselves and stay where we are and no one's going to mess with me on my property or all those things. But you know what? During a long-term SHTF scenario, as demonstrated in this book, things happen, especially in regards to natural disasters, that don't have the response we have right now, and then you end up having your house burned down and you have to leave, no matter how you felt about it. And at that point in time, you're definitely an outsider, because not only now are you a houseless refugee, but you're also somebody that still knows no one, and there's no reason for them to share any resources or supplies with you because you're a nobody. So keep that in mind. It's a hugely important lesson that I got out of this story. And then the other important lesson, number 10 on the list of the top 10 most important lessons from 1 Second After, which is a really good book, is that the government might not make it. They might not come fix the problems. They might not turn back on. They might not have these amazing secret plans with underground bunkers and underground everything and have all of this structure in place ready to flip the lights back on when things go south. That might not actually happen. They might literally have failed. And at that point in time, things will literally have to restart from the ground up, and that's it. That's your only option. And yeah, in this book, you do have some semblance of government remaining. You have the military showing up, and you have the military handing out, rations and stuff like that, which you would expect, right? But I do want to just say that it takes a very long time for that to happen, and at the same time, even when it does happen, those people who are affiliated with the government and the military can't guarantee any additional support. They can't guarantee any additional aid, and they can't guarantee they'll ever even come back. They're just trying their best. And a huge part of what happens in this book is the supply chain is what really fails. And they talk about it very often, how the Midwest has tons of farmland and low population. So more people survived there because there was more resources and less people. But the trains weren't moving and the trucks weren't moving. So because of that, they weren't able to get the grain or the agriculture to the cities or to the coastline or where there's denser populations. And so in those areas, only 10% of the population survived because there is no farmland, there's huge populations, and there's nobody to feed anyone. So there's a lot of really interesting moving parts in this book, but the government is one of them because at the end of the day, this whole thing starts with an EMP strike. And because of this EMP strike, there is basically no government. And because of that, people are on their own. And even when the government finally shows back up, they can't guarantee anything. And so you should never operate with the idea that the government can guarantee you anything, because they literally can't. So this book has a lot of important lessons in it. Leave comments below if there's other ones that I didn't mention here that you think this book is full of, because there's more than 10, I completely guarantee that. But I definitely want everyone else's input. And if you've read this book, let everybody else know in the comments just how good it is and why they should definitely read it as well. And if you haven't read the book, please check it out. I mean, honestly, literally just get a copy from the library or whatever you want to do. I mean, you don't have to buy it, but figure out a way to read it, because in my honest opinion, it's one of the better books I've read in a long, long time. And it also just gives you a lot of thought-provoking information to look towards the future of what a long-term SHTF scenario would be and actually create some decent strategies and plans based on what could occur during that time. This book is not just some work of fiction. There's a lot of well-researched information in this book that you can clearly tell the author knew what they were talking about. And I think that's very important. We need these kind of war games type scenarios in order to really push ourselves in the sense of critical thinking to get an understanding of how things really might go. So hopefully this video was helpful for you. Hopefully this gives you some things to think about. Even if you don't read the book, at least this gives you 10 important lessons from it that you already heard now, which could definitely help you along the way in the sense of being better prepared. And that's what we're trying to do here. So if you have anything else for me at all, you know where to go, magicprepper.com. And besides that, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.